Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1870, more than 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Western Hemisphere in the Atlantic slave trade. In 1619, the first African slaves were brought to Jamestown, Virginia by Dutch slave traders. By this time, Jamestown had grown with tobacco plantations as well as a representative assembly. Slaves were brought on the Dutch ship Man of War and traded for supplies. Slavery as an institution didn't exist in Jamestown. The Africans were made indentured servants. They were put to work on the tobacco plantations. Slavery and the slave trade had been practiced in Africa. Africans owned other Africans. This institution of slavery was discovered by the Portuguese. The Portuguese began taking part in the trading of slaves, and soon other Europeans were as well. Slavery was being practiced by Africans, and slaves were being sold to Europeans, as well as being sold to Arabs. The slave trade from Africa was growing as Spain as well as the English got involved. In the English colonies, John Rolfe had begun the cultivation of tobacco and was in need of low-cost labor. An irony in history is that slavery was part of colonial development. The English colonies became a stop on the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was also called the Triangular Trade or the Great Circuit. Slave ship captains would leave Europe and trade manufactured goods for slaves in Africa or even capture slaves. The slaves were taken across the Atlantic, called the Middle Passage, which was the toughest part of the journey. The slaves were then sold in the New World, and the slave ship captains would obtain raw materials to take back to Europe to sell. Each point of the process was a profit for the slave ship captains. Demand for slaves in the New World colonies grew. Slave ship captains would continue the trade even when the trade was against international law. Slave ship captains would inspect their slaves and would even advertise all across the West Indies and the Atlantic coast. On the slave ships, the slaves were treated like cargo, as they were chained together and packed on the ship as tight as possible, so that the ship could carry as many slaves as possible in order to gain more profits. Men, women, and children were separated and forced to lie on their backs on a series of platforms for at least 15 hours a day. Each slave had their right leg chained to the left leg of the person beside them. Hands were tied and shackled as well. They were put below the deck and the hatch was closed, which made it tough to breathe. The journey took weeks and survival was tough. The slave trade would be outlawed in the 1800s, but the illegal slave trade went on until slavery ended in the U.S. There was a famous slave ship revolt in 1839 aboard the Amistad, which was a slave ship owned by a Spaniard in Cuba. A slave called Cinque was known for leading the revolt. He unlocked his shackles using pieces of metal he found on the ship. He worked quickly to free the rest of the slaves as they prepared to attack their captors. The Mende Africans took control of the ship. Currents took the ship northward. U.S. newspapers reported a ship manned by black pirates. It would be captured by a U.S. ship and brought to America. Former President John Quincy Adams defended the Africans, and the Supreme Court in 1841 ruled that the Africans were free. Eventually, they were able to go back to Africa. Adams argued that since the Africans had been taken illegally, they weren't Spain's property, as Spain demanded that the slaves be sent to Cuba. The type of slavery practiced when the Portuguese discovered slavery was called Old World slavery. In this system, slavery was considered a misfortune that could happen to anyone. The slave was a person, not property, without liberty. Race had nothing to do with it, and the slave wasn't necessarily viewed as inferior. This changed in the colonies. The colonists had indentured servants, whose labor was owned, and the indentured servant worked for a certain amount of time. The indenture was a contract, usually to work off a debt owed to the owner. When the Africans were first brought to the colonies immediately put them into the indentured servant category. The difference now was that the people could visually tell the difference between Africans and other servants because of skin color. This meant that everyone knew that the Africans had to have at one time been a servant, even if the African moved to another colony after working out his or her indenture. Due to this, blacks became viewed as slaves, which now made race an implication of slavery, and the colonists would now believe the slave was owned, not just the labor. Anthony Johnson, a free black, is often considered the first to own a slave for life. John Kasser was an indentured servant to Johnson, but went to work for someone else. Johnson originally feared losing his land, but later filed suit and won, and Kasser was made his slave for life. Earlier, an African named John Punch, along with indentured servants from the Netherlands and Scotland, escaped. When captured, the whites were given 4 more years as indentured servants, but the African, John Punch, would be indentured for life. This took place in 1640, and many historians point to this event as a time when race was becoming an implication of slavery, and the first African, John Punch, was made a slave for life. There were various attempts by slaves to rise up and revolt. The most notorious was the Turner Rebellion, led by Nat Turner in 1831. It was put down, but the slaves began to see their future not looking good. Turner was a black minister. He claimed to be moved by God and Christian values. The Southerners tried to justify slavery by saying they were trying to Christianize the slaves. However, when the Turner Rebellion was put down, their use of Christianity to justify slavery no longer worked. The slaves saw their future. It was almost hopeless. Oppression would continue. Families were often split up and separated, a threat that increased as America moved west. Slave marriages weren't legal or secure. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney, would play a major role in the increased demand for slaves in the South. In the South, tobacco had been the main cash crop in the 16 and 1700s and created a demand for slaves. But by the end of the 1700s, tobacco production declined. As the tobacco market declined, so did the demand for slaves, and it appeared that slavery would soon die out in the South as it did in the North, since it was becoming less profitable. However, when cotton became a cash crop, demand for slavery grew. In addition, westward expansion meant an increased possibilities that families could be split up and no slave was safe from the separation. Whitney looked for ways to bring down costs with his inventions, such as developing a rifle with interchangeable parts. On a visit to the South, Whitney learned that cotton wasn't profitable because its production was very labor-intensive, since the seeds had to be separated out. The type of cotton that grows in the American South is a short fiber cotton that has seeds throughout the cotton and is very difficult to comb out. Wool was being used the most in textiles since it was more cost-effective, but cotton would replace wool when cotton became a cash crop, which took place for 3 major reasons. One was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin could comb out the cotton seeds, and one person using it could separate 50 times as much cotton as someone doing it by hand. Cotton production soared, and so did the demand for slaves. The trouble for Whitney was that his patent would be ignored and others copied his machine, so Eli Whitney didn't reap the economic success of his invention. A second reason cotton was able to become a cash crop was Francis Lowell developing the factory system in Massachusetts. Instead of weaving cotton into cloth in individual homes, Lowell set up a factory with several looms and could manufacture textiles. This also helped increase the production of cotton and cotton products. Once cotton became a cash crop, northern industry benefited since the northern mills and factories that existed produced goods from the southern cotton. The third factor involved in making cotton a cash crop was the Adams-Onis Treaty, which transferred Florida from Spain to the United States. This is important because there's a band of rich soil in the deep south called the Black Belt, and now the United States had access to all of this soil and the rivers that emptied into the Gulf of Mexico, making it quicker and cheaper to ship the cotton to the northern factories. With cotton now a cash crop and its production profitable, slavery grew in the South. Planting cotton and planting corn went together since they were planted and harvested at different times. This also meant that more slaves were needed all year for all of the farm work necessary. The South began to rely more and more on cotton as its main economic source. Northern textile factories relied on cotton as its main raw material to produce into a finished product in the textile mills. European nations were relying more and more on American cotton and cotton products. This would lead to the belief in the South that the world needed cotton and no one would ever do anything to threaten the cotton states. This became known as King Cotton. The South believed that if the North would ever attack them in their slavery system, that Britain would come to their aid because without their cotton, British industry would collapse. King Cotton diplomacy, however, did not work for the South, and they were unable to get foreign help during the war. The Underground Railroad was an informal network of paths through the woods, helping slaves escape to freedom. The Quakers were among the first to denounce slavery in England as well as the colonies. In 1688, the first open declaration denouncing slavery was signed by Quakers and Mennonites in the Pennsylvania colony. Religious groups first against slavery would form anti-slavery societies. One such anti-slavery society was the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. One president of the Abolition Society in Pennsylvania was Benjamin Franklin, who went to the Continental Congress and Constitutional Convention against slavery. One of the paths on the Underground Railroad through Somerset County was Glades Pike that went from Somerset to Bedford. Today it is Route 31. All of the slaves, or at least most, wanted freedom, but few had the opportunity. Most of them had very little chance of reaching free territory. The majority of those who did try to escape ended up failing in their attempts. If a runaway slave was caught, he or she would be beaten, jailed, or sold. Slave owners saw slaves as valuable property and watched them closely. Many could not leave the plantation without written permission. Once a runaway slave got to the road, he or she could be stopped and questioned by anyone who saw him or her. In parts of the South, slaves could not ride trains or cross bridges without a special pass. Runaway slaves usually traveled by night on foot with nothing to eat but the scraps they found or stole as they went. As they waded through swamps, they risked being bitten by poisonous snakes. If they failed to find food, they starved. Until they reached the north, many lived on fruit and unripe corn taken from fields. A slave that was carrying food or clothing raised suspicions. Therefore, runaways carried very little of either. Many left home without blankets and only the work clothes they were wearing. As they moved north, they faced rain, snow, and sleet. The runaways who were lucky were able to travel north on real trains or stagecoaches. Some were able to get on a steamship, usually with the help of the ship's captain. Most of the runaway slaves, however, traveled by wagon or foot. Some wagons had false bottoms for slaves to hide in. Due to being frightened and tired, runaways were relieved when they reached a safe house. Although still in danger, they knew they could count on some food and rest. The next day, the runaway slave would get clean clothes from the station master and directions to the next stop on their way north. Advertisements for the Underground Railroad appeared in northern cities. The Underground Railroad wasn't one road but many roads northward. The system consisted of dirt trails or paths through the woods, over fields, and across rivers and swamps. Although few could swim, runaway slaves often looked for water crossings where the dogs that chased them would lose the smells that helped attract them. Along these routes were farmhouses, barns, and churches where conductors hid runaway slaves for a day or a week until they could get safely to the next station on their way to freedom. The road to freedom went north into Canada. In order to get to Canada, the runaway slaves had to find a way across or around the Great Lakes. Slave hunters knew this and waited in northern towns near Niagara Falls, New York, and Detroit, Michigan. They watched ships sailing from these places in order to find the runaway slaves. Most African Americans settled in towns close to the border with the U.S. They still faced prejudice, but in Canada, black men could vote, serve on juries, and hold public office. In addition, families could live wherever they chose. Canadians set up many stations along the Canadian side of Lake Erie and around Niagara Falls. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York had many stops and routes along the Underground Railroad. Slaves living close to the Atlantic Ocean took ships going north, especially when captains helped them out. Slaves planning their escape became skilled at looking and listening and not saying a word. They communicated through songs and went north without using a map or compass. Oftentimes they left at night. If they escaped while it was dark, they sometimes got many hours away before the slave owner knew they were gone. Runaways shared secrets with the conductors who helped them escape. For example, by word of mouth, many escapees learned a simple trick to keep the slave hunters' dogs away. They would rub their bare feet or shoes with a red onion or spruce pine. On the plantations, slaves often sang religious songs called spirituals. These songs expressed their sadness, but also their hope for a better life. Sometimes messages were hidden in the words of the songs. Other songs affirmed their determination to resist and escape. One such song was "Go Down, Moses." In that song, Egypt stood for the South and Pharaoh for the slave owners. Traveling at night, conductors and runaway slaves learned to use the North Star as a compass. They first learned to search the sky for the group of stars known as the Big Dipper. It helped them find the North Star. By traveling north, runaways reached the free states. The words to the song "Follow the Drinking Gourd" also has directions for escape hidden in them. The drinking gourd is a code name for the Big Dipper. The old man is the conductor. The song advises staying close to riverbanks and says there are two rivers to cross. Another river is the Ohio River, which meets the Little River, which is the Little Tombigbee River. When clouds covered the North Star, runaways sometimes got lost. On a dark or cloudy night in the forest, slaves would run their hands up and down the sides of trees. Since moss grows best on the north side of a tree, this helped them travel in the right direction. At safe houses, owners made sure the people who came to their doors late at night were passengers and not slave hunters. Many listened for a certain number of knocks on a door or a window and a password or phrase such as baggage, meaning escaping slaves, load of potatoes, meaning escaping slaves hidden under farm produce in a wagon, and bundles of wood, meaning fugitive slaves to be expected. Oftentimes, wagons had false bottoms in to help hide the slaves as they were going to the safe houses. At some stations, homeowners put either a lantern or a candle in a window when it was safe to come to the door. John Rankin, a Presbyterian minister in Ripley, Ohio, and his wife Jean, as well as some of their neighbors, hid more than 2,000 slaves escaping northward. It was an exhausting climb up the riverbank to the Rankin house. Before the Civil War, Americans were sharply divided on the issue of slavery. In the North, many worked to end slavery by joining anti-slavery groups, giving out leaflets on streets and holding fairs and concerts to raise money to help slaves escape. Southerners were upset since the North was violating the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. In 1852, the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was published, which convinced thousands of Americans that they should work to end slavery. Over 300,000 copies of the book sold in its first year. Although she had never been in the South, Stowe based her book on real events in the lives of the slaves and runaways that she had heard about. The novel showed how cruel and terrible slavery really was. When the Civil War began, more than 200,000 African Americans ran away from southern plantations in hopes of joining the Union Army to help defeat the enemy. Harriet Tubman and other slaves served as scouts, spies, or nurses. They gave valuable information to Northern spies. Former slaves told Union spies about roads and trails through the South. They taught them how to use the North Star as a compass and where to find swamps, forests, and rivers to hide in. In return, Union soldiers fed and protected runaway slaves. During the war, African American soldiers helped former slaves learn to read and write. After the war ended, the U.S. government started schools to teach former slaves. Many schools had volunteer teachers from the North. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln officially freed all slaves living in the Confederate States. This famous declaration is called the Emancipation Proclamation, and it officially took effect on January 1, 1863. Since the fighting was still going on all over the South, at first the new law could be enforced only in areas controlled by Union soldiers. Lincoln said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." The 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1865. It outlawed slavery everywhere in the U.S. The 15th Amendment, approved in 1870, says that no U.S. citizen can be denied the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude or slavery. African Americans had the rights of other American citizens. William Lloyd Garrison was important to the Underground Railroad and abolition because he was the first to promote abolition by using his newspaper, which was called The Liberator. Elijah Lovejoy built a secret room behind a fake wall in his home in Princeton, Illinois. Once runaways were safely inside, a desk covered the opening. Other houses had tunnels that led outside or hiding places in attics, cellars, and fake closets. Lovejoy published an anti-slavery newspaper in Alton, Illinois. 3 times, angry supporters of slavery destroyed his printing press. Each time he bought a new one. In 1837, Lovejoy was killed trying to protect his 4th printing press from rioters. Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was America's first martyr for freedom of the press, supporting abolition.
Harriet Tubman is considered the Moses of our people, and the kind of courage to escape to slavery yourself, but then to go back for people. And that's the real story of connection.
Here's someone that not only advocated leaving the plantation, but actually developed an underground railroad, a process that would usher people in the still of the night to escape to the north and escape to their freedom.
I mean, just imagine you have gotten out of chattel slavery, the institution of slavery. You've escaped, and yet you come back. You have the courage and the care about other people to come back into a hell to try to get other people out of it. It's an amazing story.
No one struck more fear in the hearts of slave owners than Harriet Tubman, because tens of thousands of slave owners had to deal with, for the first time, the fact that these people are going to rebel. Well, are my slaves part of this movement? They had to look at their servants differently, because here was a woman that far beyond who she could touch, did not know who her followers were. She was far more effective as the symbol that they feared than the few hundred that she saved.
Come back. Lots of school children in America don't know a lot about slavery, but they know Harriet Tubman. It's almost a cliche, but it's a cliche that's a necessary one, because it's a story that's not just about black people, but it's about human beings caring for other people and having the courage to do what is right, even at peril to yourself. And so that's what I think her story is about.
Harriet Tubman remains an inspiration because here's a woman that was, in physical terms, not a mighty woman, had no great education, no great learning, just the sheer determination of a woman to free people and to go up against all odds and risk her life over and over again, and to change the slave's mentality made her an American and a world hero. The irony of it is, when she was once given an award for freeing 500 slaves, she said, "I could have freed more if I could have only convinced them they were slaves." She changed the minds of a lot of American blacks, and she changed American history with the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass becomes a symbol of the liberation of slaves in the country. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, "I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf. and don't understand our pain.
Frederick Douglass is important to America because, unlike most enslaved people in America, he actually makes it out of slavery, is able to tell his story, and is able to actually become an agent for change in the Black community, in America in general.
Frederick Douglass traveled the length and width and breadth of this country as a leading abolitionist that made the issue of slavery a paramount issue through his editing newspapers, through his ceaseless travels and lectures. He helped to make it a real movement that by the time Abe Lincoln is running against Douglass, it is a national discussion. It would not have happened if you didn't have a spokesperson that worked as tirelessly as Frederick Douglass did.
Douglass is someone who is known in this country. He travels to England. He's an international figure. So he's important because he can tell you about slavery, the institution of slavery, because he lived it, and he can speak about that time period. He can tell you about escaping to freedom, and he can tell you about the free world. He bridges gaps. He's a part of transformation of America at this pivotal moment. And it's someone who, as I said, who begins under the cover of slavery and then ends outside of that.
The house of Levi and Catherine Coffin in Newport, Indiana, was a station along the Underground Railroad. Scholars think the railroad got its name from slave hunters searching the house for 17 escaped slaves who had safely moved on. One of the slave hunters said, "There's an Underground Railroad around here and Levi Coffin is its president." Others repeated those words. The network had a name. The Quakers were one of the first religious groups to speak out against slavery and help runaways. They believed no person should be owned by another. Coffin was a Quaker businessman who raised a lot of money for the Underground Railroad and did become known as the president of the Underground Railroad. John Fairfield was a conductor from a wealthy slaveholding family in Virginia, but he was against slavery. To help slaves escape, he put on different disguises, pretending to be a slave trader, slaveholder, or a peddler. His southern accent helped him fool slave owners. On one trip to rescue slaves, he snuck 28 slaves over the roads near Cincinnati by hiring a hearse and disguising the group as a funeral procession. Calvin Fairbank was a minister who would disguise those he helped escape rather than disguise himself. He dressed boys in girls' clothing and girls in boys' clothing to fool slave hunters looking for a specific runaway. He spent 17 years in jail for his work on the Underground Railroad, as he was sentenced in 1844 for aiding and abetting fugitive slaves. Josiah Henson was a slave whose owner promised to free him if he worked hard and earned $350. When Henson earned that amount, his owner raised the price to $1,000. Therefore, Henson looked to escape to Canada after he found out that his owner planned to sell him away from his wife and their 4 children. He and his family were able to escape. His autobiography, Truth is Stranger Than Fiction, is widely believed to have inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Henson set up the Dawn Settlement in Dresden, Canada, where former slaves learned new skills and trades that helped them get started in their new lives. Henry Box Brown was a slave from Virginia who got his nickname due to being a carpenter who built a wooden box just big enough to sit in. He got inside carrying food and a tool for making air holes in the wood. A friend nailed the box shut and mailed it to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. The trip took 26 hours. Part of that time, Brown was upside down. He arrived safely at the society. Members were expecting him and quickly opened the box. William Still was a slave who became an abolitionist and helped others escape on the Underground Railroad. He often was called Father of the Underground Railroad, helping over 800 slaves escape and keeping track of each and every one of them with good records. After the war, he developed the YMCA for African Americans as he cared about the welfare of black children. He also developed an orphanage for black children in Philadelphia. Slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad wanted to get to Canada where they could be guaranteed their freedom. In the Deep South, slaves could find refuge in Florida before it had become a state, as well as Cuba, Mexico, Haiti, the Bahamas, and Jamaica. The Underground Railroad is an example of average, regular citizens working to make their society and their country better. The abolitionist movement worked to end slavery, and led the way into the Civil War as the war to end slavery, making America more equal.